Hello and welcome to the webinar, Using AI to Improve the Innovation Process. My name is Cosmo Asla, Director of Research Products here at Lux Research, and I will be moderating today's session. Our speaker today will be Lux VP Kevin C. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all of the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. At this point, I would like to introduce Lux Research's Kevin C.
Thanks, Cosmin. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining today's webinar. Obviously, these are strange times, so we certainly appreciate the opportunity to connect with all of you and hope everyone is healthy and happy. Given the unique situation I think we're all in, appreciate it if you excuse any unplanned noises that pop up in the background, but we'll do our best to keep those to a minimum. Excited to have a chance to talk to you today about this topic, as it's something we've been working on and something I've been passionate about for a while. And that is really aiming to give you some practical advice on how to apply artificial intelligence to the innovation process itself. We know from working with our clients and from just interacting in our network that, of course, everyone's interested in deploying AI for one thing or another, but they often don't know where to start or how to find the tangible use cases. So our goal is to identify an actual tool and explain how it works to some extent, but also present a specific set of use cases to really help you think through where and how AI can make an impact in that specific world. So we have 3 acts to the presentation. The first is to talk about really the overall opportunity and what kind of AI tools can help us leverage some of the data we'll be talking about. Then we'll jump into case studies of how AI is being deployed, this type of AI and this type of application is being applied, and then apply it to the innovation use case, right? So I'll talk about what I mean by innovation later, but it's really the idea of finding, exploring, monetizing a new idea, right? And then we'll make it more tangible by showing you how to actually apply AI for a specific one of those use cases, which is what we call technology landscaping, which is something we work with our clients on very frequently. So first, I want to set the stage with the scale of the opportunity here. I'd like you to take a second, just stare at these numbers, absorb them, the magnitude, and I'll give you some context for what they mean in a second, but just kind of take a look at them, think about them for a second. And once you've had a chance to do that, I'll show you what they are. And on the top line, there's the number of tweets per minute or the number of emails per minute, really an incredible amount of data being produced. At the bottom, certainly relevant for the innovation use cases, patents and academic papers. We're talking multi-millions produced each year by a global community. And so I show you this because these data have one thing in common. And I'll give you another second to think about what that might be. What they have in common is the fact that they are all unstructured data in the form of text. And I want to show you this because my hypothesis is there's a tremendous amount of value buried in this unstructured data, but as a community, we really haven't figured out how to extract it effectively. So really speaks to the scale of this opportunity, the amount of data that's floating around out there. So if text is the data set, unstructured data in the form of text, what is the tool set we can use to apply and extract insight from that data? Well, this is something you may have heard a lot about, natural language processing. A dictionary sort of definition would be a field of artificial intelligence that enables computers to analyze and understand human language. From our perspective, we put a little bit of a spin on it, and I view it more as not an academic idea or tool, but a specific kind of tool that can extract insight from a sea of data that is typically pretty unwieldy and inefficient to parse. And I suspect many of you on this webinar today, if you were to think about the data sources you use, you can think about how much time you actually spend trying to extract insight from text data. So NLP is developing at a very rapid pace. Just a few data points or examples. Hugging Face, which provides, among other things, an open source NLP library that has transformer models or really the most advanced deep learning models, makes it more accessible and easier to apply to different use cases. Recently raised 15 million in a Series A. OpenAI has a fake text generator that the creators actually thought was so good it was almost too dangerous to release due to concerns over things like fake news and things like that. Google, of course, one of the leaders in this space for a long time, has been using natural language processing for a long time to power their search. They've advanced that even farther with a platform called BERT, which is aiming to take the understanding of search queries to an even another level. And it's really an advanced way to parse and analyze text. And then another example is the Allen Institute, which has a system that actually, on a multiple choice 8th grade and 12th grade science test, actually achieved new high scores, far surpassing what previous NLP systems were able to do. Excuse me. So it's really speaks to the amount of momentum, the amount of development, and really the pace of progress that's going on in this space. So I think that bodes well for maybe some other use cases that aren't as well known, or one we're going to talk about, which is the innovation process itself. So what's a way to taxonomize or look at natural language processing? We have a number of people on our team looking at AI in general, and we have a deeper dive into NLP, where we've looked at information extraction versus text analytics, natural language generation, conversational AI. So there's many ways to slice and dice this space. You'll see that there's certainly a great number of startups attacking these different use cases, but you also see, of course, the large players, IBM, Amazon, Google, that you'd expect to be pushing this space forward. So a lot of activity for many different facets of NLP. The money speaks to this as well. So we ballpark in 2019 that investment in NLP cleared 1.3 billion. You can see from the chart that it's been rapidly climbing over recent years as people have started to see the potential for this technology. If you look at the research into NLP in general, you can see both patents and academic papers have been climbing pretty rapidly as well over, say, past 5 to 10 years. So again, all of this is speaking to the momentum and pace of development for this particular AI tool, which we're going to show you can serve a lot of different purposes. So coming back to the original point, the statistics I showed you, text data is extremely prevalent, but I feel it's quite under-leveraged. So if you think about the data tools that are available to you, or the data sources available to you, there's obviously the internet, which can be broken down into other things like news, social media. Lots of enterprises have things like maintenance notes and lab notebooks. We've got academic papers and so on, right? Internal documents, public documents, all kinds of things are housed in unstructured data sets like text. And there's a huge opportunity to make the most of this. And that's, if there's nothing else you remember from this webinar, it's to really think about the data you are sitting on that can be leveraged for more. Some studies show that over 80% of all enterprise data is unstructured. So again, it gives you an idea of the scale here. We are sitting on a ton of data that we haven't maximized. So how do we go ahead and think about putting this tool to work on all of that data? Well, the first thing to do after that is to talk about some example case studies. How can NLP actually be used? And then I promised you this was going to be about the innovation use case. So from one point forward, we'll start to dive into what innovation means and how NLP can play a more specific role there. So what are some base use cases for NLP? There's clustering, which essentially groups together similar types of documents or news, for example, and data miners are a company doing this. You can do semantics and contextual analysis, which essentially is deriving taxonomies and ontologies, concept maps based on a set of documents, and there's startups doing that like Kindi. Sentiment analysis, which is what is the sentiment associated with the text I'm reading? Is it positive, negative, or neutral? We have automated generation of reports, so you can imagine you have a process that's spitting out quantitative data. You may want to spin that into more written reports. So there are ways to automate that process so you can essentially automatically generate reports based on that data. So a number of different use cases. If we look at some specific case studies, two we just wanted to call out to just show you the power of NLP is Signqual, which worked with a large railway system manufacturer. This railway manufacturer had data housed in SharePoint, in SAP, IBM, Office, a whole bunch of different platforms, really disparate, difficult to search, and difficult to unify. So one of the big parts of this value proposition for this project was plugging into all those data sources and making them universally searchable. But it also allowed you to recommend or link to similar types of concepts or data. And they found that this really improved project performance, it improved efficiency, and estimated a savings of $60 million a year. So a quantitative or a specific ROI on deploying this technology. More from a research perspective, UC Berkeley and Toyota, a set of material scientists were looking at using NLP to see if they could extract insight from academic papers. Really, if you're like me, kind of into this particular space, it's really fascinating that without any explicit assumption of any knowledge of chemistry or materials, this analysis could extract things like the underlying structure of the periodic table, for example. So some really fascinating ways to leverage NLP, again, to extract insight in a way that does not assume prior knowledge. And now I want to shift gears to the innovation use case. So we talked about some general use cases for NLP, some examples of how it can make an impact. As I said, the premise of this webinar is how to make an impact on innovation. So while it is a highly collaborative environment, ultimately innovation is very much a competition. Corporations, governments, VCs, all types of organizations are looking to get a head start on finding the next big thing. So how do you find, develop, and monetize something new? This talk is not going to be a tutorial on innovation processes, but we do want to spend a little bit of time on how this process actually works. And how it generally works is that there's typically ideas floating around in your organization, outside your organization that you want to gather. You want to feed those ideas through something like a funnel. People call them stage gates. Some people do this formally, some people do it informally. But the idea is that there's a way for you to sift through a plethora of ideas, start to use different criteria to narrow down the ones that are most promising until you get all the way through all these gates or all the way through this funnel, and you ultimately have a profitable product or an operational deployment that saves you a bunch of money, but there's a tangible outcome from those ideas to an end result. So if we think about this, I'm going to focus on the front end of this process right now. A lot of things we could talk about throughout. There's a lot of digital tools and other things we could talk about throughout here, but I want to focus on, say, ideation through stage 2, and what's usually called something like the front end of innovation. So what are specific use cases for NLP at the front end of that innovation process? And we'll dive into these a bit more, but landscaping. This is something we do with our technology clients very, very frequently, which is the idea that you want to break down a space of interest, find out who is working on what, and ultimately plot and analyze trends. So this is really helping you get through that beginning process of, is this idea one that's worth me passing on to the next stage? Certainly researchers and others are really interested in concept similarity. So you can actually use NLP to say, I found this great paper on topic X. Is there a way for a system to suggest other documents, other papers that are like this, so that I can build a more comprehensive view and better knowledge around this particular concept? So it's taking one document, looking at its fingerprint, and finding other ones that are like it. Competitive analysis. So you can imagine, we talked about all that text data. If you were able to accumulate all that unstructured data associated with one of your most interesting competitors, you can start to build out a library of data. It's press releases, academic papers, patents, news, and so forth. Imagine you could take that comprehensive data set and actually use NLP or use a tool to start to parse out what the key concepts. So ultimately trying to automate or get a quicker answer to what are my competitors working on. And lastly, certainly interesting at the very front end of this process is the weak signal detection. So the idea that you can spot something that's potentially big before others. And there's numerous cases of whoever got there first. So could you look at academic papers, news, social media to know when a certain technology is popping up? Or could you use it to identify when people are starting to become much more concerned about single-use plastics, right? The backlash there in terms of sustainability. So there's a lot of use cases and data sets that can help you identify some of these weak signals early on so that you can act quickly and get ahead of the curve. So those are some of the key ways you can use NLP at the front end. Going forward from here, I want to spend some time on demonstrating that actual tech landscaping use case, because we have a data science team here at Lux. We actually built and are using some of these tools to see if we can provide deeper insight to our clients and get to the right answer faster. So we'll focus on landscaping. I explained to you what I meant by landscaping, but it's take a big space, break it down, who's working on what are the trends over time, some of those key things to help you identify what should I be working on ultimately. So how is technology landscaping done today? Basically, it can be pretty overwhelming because there is so much of this data that I talked about out there that you can do an analysis, but there's always a risk of it taking a long time and honestly of you missing something, because a person can only be so rigorous in terms of the analysis that they do in terms of a landscape. So where I want to bring AI into this is, what if you could take that sea of documents and somehow get to those auto-generated concepts you should care about in a more streamlined fashion, right? Take the big and break it into something small without having to do all the manual work in between. And I'm going to blow this out a little bit to give you an idea of kind of a before and after, or a comparison side by side of these two approaches. So how much you do technology landscaping now? The status quo is you identify a large space you're interested in, and you break it down into parts. So you need someone smart, or you need someone to become smart on a topic and build a taxonomy. I have space X, I break it into smaller slices, and then I go ahead with all those slices. Hopefully I found all the slices I care about. You manually search all iterations of those different subsets. You do a whole bunch of searches, you generate a whole bunch of data, you turn the crank, you plot it, you find out who the key players are, and hopefully you end up with a pretty comprehensive view of that particular technology, which can help you move forward. So this is not maybe exactly how a lot of you do it, but it's pretty close, and it's pretty ubiquitous in terms of a process across anyone trying to learn about a new technology. how does the AI approach differ? Well, first, you define the space generally, and you just have to define it well enough to get to that first sea of documents, that first collection of documents about the topic you care about. You don't have to slice it up into smaller parts. You just need it to be general enough to capture everything that you think you care about. You run a model to cluster the concepts. So you put it through AI and it auto-generates the concepts. So it takes that big mass of documents and text, breaks it into the auto-generated concepts. I'll talk about this more in a bit, but you got to label those topics, plot the trends and key players. You may get the same answer. In many cases, you may get an even more rigorous answer where you caught things you may have missed before. So what are the ultimate benefits here? Well, the ultimate benefits here are the speed at which you can do this, and if you compare the before and after case, and the fact that you can get unbiased and comprehensive results. So from our perspective, we certainly wouldn't advocate anyone using AI or machine learning just because it's fun or just because it's hot. Here, we believe that as these tools evolve and as we streamline the interfaces, you can really get these two benefits out of using these tools. So I showed you a black box on the AI, and if you looked closely, you'll notice that it said topic model. So if we take AI, take NLP as a subset of an AI, and take topic modeling as a specific tool within NLP, a topic model is a type of statistical model for discovering the abstract topics that occur in a collection of documents. So this is our weapon of choice within the NLP toolbox that we've been using within Lux. So just setting the stage again, you got a bunch of documents, put it through the topic model, generates the concepts, and then you can start to slice and dice the data, get the trends, and get the key players. You'll often hear about the concept of human in the loop. Now, what does that mean here? What's important to know is that AI has limitations. You know, the days in which you put something into a black box and it tells you everything you need to know about anything just aren't here yet. So what the model can do very effectively is cluster concepts that are commonly occurring, but it can't name them, at least not yet. So you need a human who's knowledgeable to look at those clusters and name them. But the person who's doing it matters too. So in order to label or exclude topics, you really have to have enough expertise to understand what you're looking at. So you're going to have to become smart enough to say, this cluster of documents really reflects such and such concept. So it's important to note, and I'll come back to this, that the human really matters here. So let's put this to use and let's look at a real example. What if I identify a space I'm interested in, but it's fairly broad in general, or I don't know where to start, or I don't want to go through that slicing process where I have to break it into smaller parts. I don't want to do all that work beforehand before I can even get started. So we did this example, we did this process as an example for two-dimensional materials. For anyone who's somewhat familiar with emerging tech, you've likely heard of graphene. Turns out a whole family of materials like graphene that essentially are atomically thin, covalently bonded in 2 dimensions, that have really unique properties, physical, electric, electronic, thermal, really unique properties, which is why everyone's interested in how to make them and how to leverage them for a plethora of different use cases. So how do we go about doing this? So what we do first is define a search for 2D materials patents. So this, to be clear, the data set we're using here is patents. We define a general enough 2-dimensional search that we get back all the patents that we care about for 2D materials. That's all we've done is a general search. We plug all those documents into the topic model. We get the auto-generated concepts. And now we can start to slice and dice that data and get to the trends, key players. In this case, it'll be more, we know, companies like IBM or Samsung Electronics. So we have some validation, hope we should get the answer to some extent that we expect, but we should expect to see a lot of things that we might not have found otherwise. So we get these auto-generated clusters, and we do that human-in-the-loop process I talked about of labeling. Now, if you want to talk about more about how the labeling works and what the outputs look like, I'm not going to go into that here, but we're happy to do subsequent conversations about it. But suffice to say, this is a space I was somewhat familiar with, so I could go through the clustered documents and identify some key topics. Fabrication of these materials, fabrication or synthesis, application in nanocomposites, electronic devices like semiconductors and transistors, novel platforms like oxides or MXenes, energy storage, optoelectronics. So this all comes out of one model. And what we do next is we want to look at one of them to see what kind of insight we can pull out of that particular use case, out of that particular topic. So one that we chose to dig into a little bit more is energy storage. So if we look at the data that's returned for energy storage, what's a typical patent associated with the energy storage topic? Composites comprising nanosheets of transition metal oxide for cathodes of lithium sulfur cells. Okay, that's spot on, right? We know from our battery research that that's obviously highly relevant. The model tells you what the keywords associated with the topic are. When you have to label it, it's a helpful set of data. So battery, cathode, anode, separator, electrochemical. Immediately, this points us towards the energy storage example. We can pull out who the key players are. So Nanotech Instruments, Samsung Electronics, you see universities in here. Anyone who's part of that patent data set can be returned here. And then you get the patents over time. So this all falls out of the data. You could do this for all the topics that come out of the model. To the point of the human in the loop, there's one interesting example where one of the topics appeared to be footwear. And this was strange to us. And it really requires, again, that human in the loop here. So we looked at the patent, and what we found was that the term two-dimensional material actually referred to anything flat. It had nothing to do with materials like graphene. It was really any generally flat material, and that's not what we mean. So you have to do a little bit of investigation. There has to be a human who knows what's happening here to rule out some of these things that might be more nonsensical. But if we proceed from there, we can plot out these different topics against each other. So you can look at materials, novel materials versus electronic devices versus composites. And you start to get at where is the momentum, who's working on what. And you can start to plot that out. So for the different top topics, who are the key players? And you can look at this in kind of market map. So this is an example of how you can consolidate some of the information coming out of that model. And you could do this across all topics and et cetera. And it really did come out of that one process that we applied. So that's one example. We're happy to talk further about problems you're facing or ideas or topics you might want to attack. We have in the works other studies we're doing along these lines, trying to understand other spaces like how are materials evolving for mobility or things like that. So a lot of projects that we have underway. But in the end, I want to wrap up by coming back to why you should even concern yourself with AI, or really the application of it that I talked about today. And one of the key things is you really need to, why you should be interested is, among other things, you need to find your next billion-dollar business, or at least the next big business that's going to drive growth for your company. For products you already have that you have to innovate, for example, you need to build a protective moat versus your competitors. Any innovation team, we know how hard it is to measure success for these groups, but you got to find new opportunities faster with higher rates of success. However you measure it, that is a mandate, particularly now in the current environment, that everything has to be as fruitful as possible. And you got to make your team more efficient in their everyday work. And coming back to that initial premise in the beginning, you really need to monetize data that you have not leveraged yet. So You're sitting essentially on a gold mine. How can we make the most of it? So if you look at some tangible examples, what's a little bit of a cheat sheet on the data sets you could start to think about using across these different use cases? If you're doing landscaping, a perfect set of data to think about are patents and academic papers that you all use every day anyways. Concept similarity, remember this is the idea that one document I like has a fingerprint. Let me find other documents with similar fingerprints. Patents, academic papers, news, market research, all of those things could lend themselves to finding other things that might be of interest to you. Competitive analysis, again, there's a ton of data on your competitors out there. Patents, academic papers, news, press releases. Can you gather and house that data? And then can you apply a tool, maybe like topic modeling, to parse out what's buried underneath it? Weak signal detection. I talked about the single-use plastics idea. There's a lot of things about, for example, consumer preferences that you might be able to mine from social media, academic papers, news, internal documents. So there's a ton of data. Again, this is just to get you started thinking about what do I have at my disposal that I haven't leveraged or I'm not leveraging as strongly as I could, and start to think about different ways to process that data. So to wrap up, I just want to leave you with a few points, and then I'm happy to take questions. We're ready to go on that. One is that if you want to do this, and obviously we think you should, you have to build and buy capabilities. That means building out potentially at least a small data science team, having some semblance of software engineering to make those tools a little bit more user-friendly. Short of that, it's very likely you might be able to find a partner that can help you along the way here. It may be one that has domain expertise in the area you're interested in. It may be someone with the data science capabilities so that you can bring your domain expertise to the table. But I'd really think about a hybrid of both building and buying capabilities. Really want to stress, and this was one of the points of that human in the loop discussion, is that machine learning is there to augment, not replace. We see a lot of hesitation to apply, hesitation in digital transformation in general. So it's important to send the message that machine learning, topic modeling, NLP can make you better at your job, but not replace you. And very strongly related to that is just driving the cultural acceptance. So, you know, in other walks of digital transformation, like if you were trying to digitally transform your factory, a lot of the workers on the floor, for example, are resistant to it because they view it as a threat, or there's a difficulty getting cultural buy-in. So this is where a top-down commitment and explanation of the role of technology and how it really helps you do better is a pretty important message to send across the enterprise. And lastly, again, keep coming back to those data sources. I showed you how much of it there is. Think about what you've got. Think about what you can do with it. Think about how that can drive you to better decisions faster. That's what, that's the final takeaway. That's what I urge you to do, is really think about this. We're happy to be your partners in brainstorming on how to do this. But with that, I'll wrap up. I appreciate everyone joining, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. So we will now be taking questions. Please do keep sending those in. We've already gotten some great ones coming in, but keep typing those out. Remember, you can type those into the questions box in the app. And if we do not get to your question on this call, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. So the first question that I wanted to start off with here are around what are the pros and cons of using NLP to analyze patents compared to conventional patent software. Somebody mentioned Questel's Orbit Intelligence platform, for example, as a way that somebody might go about doing a conventional patent search. So when we look at this AI NLP approach, what are some of the pros and cons of using this?
Yeah, so the way I would think about it is how much of the burden is on the user. So purely from the customer standpoint, like you as the user trying to do a patent analysis, there are very robust search tools. They have a huge data set, but they often demand a lot of the user, right? So the burden is primarily on you. So one of the pros of AI is that essentially it reduces that burden to some extent. Lets you focus. I would think of it as instead of putting all that work in up front to figure out what you want to search for, it kind of accelerates that process so you can spend more time looking at the results. So that I would view as one of the pros of machine learning or AI in this case. And there are cons, right? The cons are, do you have the capability to do it, right? So do you have a partner who can do it? Do you have a data science team that can build it? Frankly, a lot of companies have data science teams, but they're not great at building tools and software. So they end up with really clunky versions of this that actually don't return a lot of value. So when you think about doing it, even though in a perfect world, if you have the perfect tool, I think it's better, you have to think about how to execute on building the capability so that it's seamless, it's streamlined, and so that it's something that people want to use. Because at the end of the day, you still have customers, the R&D scientists, the innovation leaders. If they don't like the tool or they don't feel like it's fun to use or beneficial to them, they're not going to use it. So there's always a obstacle to overcome there as well.
All right, fantastic. Now for the next question, I'm actually going to combine two of them because they're approaching a similar kind of question from two different angles. And it starts off first with a compliment. Thank you for the clear presentation. And the question is, are there any ready-to-use NLP-driven topic models out there? And kind of the other related question is, has anybody, any startups or any other companies put together end-to-end offerings to address this kind of automated innovation in the space?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a few levels to that. The first is the first level of off the shelf is essentially packages and libraries in coding languages like Python that are very robust. And if you have some data science and coding capability in your team, assuming you can sacrifice or not sacrifice, assuming you have that bandwidth, there are ways to get started in a pretty lightweight way. It is a longer haul to get to that polished interface that I talked about. But then if you look at the startup landscape, there's some end-to-end solutions that are more specifically about like social media data or things like that, where they isolate, news, like trying to get you cutting edge news events. So there's not kind of a universal tool that lets you drop in the data set you care about and just magically get an answer. If you have a very specific use case, like I want to potentially get news alerts ahead of when everyone else does, there are platforms that can do that or startups that are doing that. But I would say I haven't seen a one-size-fits-all solution that really gives you the flexibility in terms of data sets and in terms of the outputs that you want.
Great. Now, the next question is a little bit more technical. So it talks about how do we address ambiguity when we talk about topics or terms. So as one current example, the question mentions there's currently dozens of ways to refer to COVID-19. So how does AI, how does NLP deal with this kind of ambiguity where we're talking about the same concept, but the terms used might be different?
Yeah, there's a few things that it makes me think of. One is upfront in the process. I mentioned you're going to have to feed it essentially what we call a master search to capture the world you're interested in. So there is some work that goes into architecting that with synonyms and other things to make it as robust a search as possible. So I don't want to present this as a panacea where you do no work. You do have to do some work to get to the right scope up front. In terms of parsing those concepts clearly, I don't worry so much about synonyms like the COVID example, because the way that most of these for example, topic modeling will work is really by building a comprehensive fingerprint for the whole document. So it's really considering a fuller body of text than just, it's not simply saying, I see this word a lot. It's saying, I see these words together, commonly. And so because of that next level of clustering, I think you should, in many cases, start to see a lot of those things that may be referred to differently. If they're written about in similar ways, you should actually see them clustered together still. So, and again, that's where you need a human to take a look at it and understand that. But there are some things built into that process that helps you overcome some of those issues.
All right, fantastic. And I think we have time for 2 more questions. So the next one that that I wanted to highlight here is actually talking about different sources. So there's potentially different sources that could have contradictory or conflicting information. So for example, you might have social media like a Twitter feed where you have tens of thousands of opinions that are expressed. But then you also have experimental data. You might have academic papers or peer-reviewed paper, and that might contradict what was in the other data set. So how do we think about looking at different data sets and analyzing them and potentially combining them to arrive at a conclusion?
Yeah, that's a tricky thing because on the one hand, I mean, as a scientist by training, I always like the idea of a figure of merit, right? One factor to tell me what I should think. I think given the data sets that were cited in this question, it is worth thinking about whether they should be combined. I think, I'm not saying absolutely not, but the insight that you'll draw out of Twitter may be very different than the insight you're looking to draw out of academic papers. So an example would be Twitter really, for example, you'd be looking at sentiment. You might be looking at the volume of mentions of a particular technology or something. So there are other use cases, but one thing you might want to know is, are people, again, to come back to the single-use plastics idea, or are there things that people are changing their mass sentiment about that would change the products we make? Academic papers are obviously going to be highly geared towards a technical audience, right? The Twitter one might be product groups, marketing groups, but an R&D scientist probably is not going to be as interested in Twitter as a useful data set. But that's where you might unleash the academic papers, where they might find great value in the idea of concept similarity or some of these other ways of using these tools. So I think it's worth thinking about when and why to combine these data sets, because it's not always a no-brainer that you should.
Okay, great. And last question, this is more about Lux's own business model. A question that came in from one of the attendees was, does Lux offer an AI tool to clients, or do we use it as a service internally?
Yeah, predominantly it's been built as an internal service that we use to do better work in research and get better insights out to our clients. We have started to think about and actually had a lot of interest from clients in terms of engaging around using the tool to solve a particular problem or look at a particular area. So we're not at I'd say we're not at the state where we're selling an off-the-shelf software tool. If you're interested in doing this, whether we can give advice to help you do it better or whether we can actually help you do it directly, I'd say we're happy to entertain those conversations.
All right, great. Thank you, Kevin. So this concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and recording from the webinar will be sent to all attendees via email today. After leaving the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. We would appreciate any feedback you may have to help inform and improve future webinars. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day.